This is our fourth annual Diversity Disclosure Practices Report. And like our prior reports, it is meant to inform readers not only of the number and proportion of women who are on boards and in executive officer roles and the number and proportion of companies that have adopted specified best practices, but also provides a summary of legislative, regulatory, investor, media, and research developments that have occurred over the past years to provide meaningful context for those numbers. Our report is also meant to inspire readers by providing information about best practices that have been adopted by companies and voluntarily disclosed by them to increase the representation of women, and by highlighting the names of companies that have achieved success. Well, currently, the disclosure requirements are focused on increasing the proportion of female directors and executive officers. So companies are required to disclose the number and proportion of female directors and executive officers. They're required to disclose whether there's a written diversity disclosure policy focused on increasing the representation of women in those roles, any targets or goals that have been adopted, and whether the company considers the representation of women when recruiting directors or appointing executive officers. It's a comply or explain approach, so companies that do not comply with some of those practices are required to explain why. This year's report demonstrates improvement, but at a very slow pace. Women currently hold 16.4% of board seats, but that represents an increase of only 1.8% compared to last year. Of the board positions that became available, women were appointed to the seats roughly a third of the time. However, the number of all-male boards has decreased. More than 2/3 of all companies now have at least one woman on the board, and a third of all companies have 2 or more women on the board. So there is some improvement. A majority of companies have now adopted written policies for diversity, but only about 40.3% of companies have disclosed that their policy on diversity relates to the increase in the number of women. Well, the pace of change has to improve. At the current rate, it will take us another 19 years to get to gender parity on boards, and just to get to a 30% level is going to take us another 8 years. Companies are reluctant to adopt targets. Only 17% of companies have adopted targets for the representation of women on the board, although a majority of the larger companies have adopted targets. But at the executive officer level, there has been almost no change over the 4 years that we have been doing our reports. There is currently about 1.5 female executive officers on average among companies, representing about 15% of the executive officers, and that hasn't changed over the period of time. Companies tend not to adopt targets at the executive officer ranks. Only 6% of companies have done so, and only 20% even of the larger companies have done so. Board composition, including gender diversity, needs to be a recurring topic at the board level. And senior management and the board need to support increasing diversity amongst the executive officer ranks. Diversity needs to be measured and monitored to identify potential bottlenecks. In our report, we've highlighted best practices that companies have adopted and voluntarily disclosed in order to attract and retain women and to develop women as potential leaders within the organization. We've also identified companies that have achieved gender parity, either at the board level or at the executive officer ranks.